In the summer of 1999, a major motion picture asked its audience to watch a group of grade school children form a human shield and go to war against their own mother. The mothers had an army, the president, and a public execution scheduled for the two comedians the children loved most. The children had a homemade resistance and the certainty that the adults raising them had lost their mind. Beneath the singing and the swearing, the film made the same argument the show has made since its first year, that in South Park, the most dangerous people in a child's life are parents. A mother who has her son fitted with a chip that shocks him when he speaks. A father more childish than his own son. A town of adults who would sooner throw themselves off a building than pay attention at home. Children have been fighting their parents for nearly 30 years and losing the whole time in ways the show has never quite let them notice. Welcome to East Park. Let's get into it. The Terrence and Phillip Wars, the first real statement South Park ever made about parents, arrived in its first season, and the show made it by turning the parents into the antagonists of a story about a cartoon. The episode was called Death. It aired on Comedy Central on the 17th of September in 1997, only weeks into the show's existence, and it was the last of the original 6 episodes the network had ordered before deciding whether South Park would become a series at all. On its surface, the episode was about two things that had nothing to do with each other. Stan's grandfather, Marvin, was turning 102, and his only birthday wish was for his grandson to help him die. At the same time, Kyle's mother, Sheila Broflovsky, had discovered the cartoon her son and his friends could not stop watching, a crude Canadian program about two men named Terrence and Phillip who did almost nothing but pass gas and insult each other. What connected the two halves of the episode was a single idea that would become the foundation of the entire series. The adults of South Park were willing to wage total war over the content of a children's cartoon, and they were willing to do it precisely because waging that war was easier than the actual work of raising children. Sheila's reaction sets the pattern that the show would return to for decades. She catches Kyle watching Terrence and Phillip. She is horrified by the fart jokes and the language, and within a single afternoon she has telephoned every other parent in town and organized a campaign. The campaign is not small. It is not a letter to the network. The adults of South Park travel across the country to the headquarters of the channel airing the show, a network the episode calls Cartoon Central, and they chain themselves to the building. When chaining themselves accomplishes nothing, they escalate. More than a dozen of them hurl themselves to their deaths against the headquarters as a form of protest, on the theory that a high enough body count will force the show off the air. The grotesque joke of the episode is the way the standoff actually ends. The network does not cave because parents are dying outside its door. It caves because the protesters, having caught a violent stomach illness from Kenny, have turned the protest site into a biological disaster, and the easiest way to make the problem go away is to cancel the cartoon. The parents win. They celebrate. Then the replacement program turns out to contain mild insults of its own, and Sheila immediately begins preparing the next protest. The cycle has no end built into it because the thing the parents are actually fighting is not any specific show. It is the existence of a culture their children enjoy that they did not create and cannot control. The episode is openly contemptuous of the adult, and it is contemptuous in a specific direction. While the entire grown population of South Park is in another state throwing itself against building to protect children from a cartoon, the children themselves have been left completely alone. Stan is at home with a grandfather who is actively trying to manipulate him into committing a killing. At one point, Grandpa Marvin hands Stan a rope, distracts him with the very cartoon the adults are protesting, and uses the moment to attempt to hang himself with the boy holding the other end. Stan's sister Shelly intervenes before anything irreversible happens. No parent is anywhere near the house. The adults of South Park have decided that the gravest threat to their children is a flatulence joke on television, and in the time they spend fighting that threat, an actual child in their town comes within seconds of being party to a death. The show frames this with no subtlety. The parents want television to be clean and wholesome so that the entertainment industry can raise their children for them, freeing the adults from having to be present in the lives they are responsible for. That is the joke. That is also the thesis. What gives the episode its strange durability is the fact that it was a response to something real. South Park had spent its first weeks being dismissed by critics as nothing more than primitive animation and toilet humor, and the creators answered that criticism by building an entire episode around it. Terrence and Phillip, the cartoon within the cartoon, is a deliberate parody of the worst possible version of South Park, a show that truly is nothing but fart joke. The parents protesting Terrence and Phillip are a parody of the real adults protesting South Park, and the children defending the cartoon, sneaking off to watch it the moment the adults leave, are a parody of the show's own audience. From its first season, South Park had decided who its recurring villain would be. The villain was the parent who confuses moral panic with parenting, who would rather rather burn down an industry than sit in a room and pay attention. The show cast that figure as the enemy, and it never recast the role. 2 years later, the show took this premise and expanded it to the size of a feature film and a world war. South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut, was released to theaters on the 30th of June in 1999, made for roughly $21 million and earning more than $83 million worldwide, with its song Blame Canada nominated for the Academy Award for Best Original Song. The structure of the film is the structure of death rebuilt on an enormous scale. The four boys sneak into an R-rated Terrence and Phillip movie called Asses of Fire. They come out of the theater swearing constantly, and they spread the swearing to every child at school. The school counselor, Mr. Mackey, reports the language to the mother. And from that small spark, the mothers of South Park, led once again by Sheila Broflovsky, build a machine of escalating cruelty that ends with the world on the edge of destruction. The mechanism of the escalation is the part that matters for understanding how the show sees parents. Sheila does not respond to her son's swearing by talking to her son. She forms an organization called Mothers Against Canada, abbreviated in the film as MAC, and she treats the problem as a foreign threat rather than a domestic one. The blame is exported wholesale onto Canada, the country that produced Terrence and Phillip, because blaming an entire nation is easier than examining the home. The song Blame Canada lays the logic out completely. Everything that has gone wrong with the children is somebody else's fault. Somebody foreign, somebody who can be punished without the parents ever having to look at themselves. The film treats this as the central comic engine and the central moral failure at the same time. The mothers would rather start a war than accept that they might be the problem. The war is literal. Terrence and Phillip are arrested as war criminals. The United States declares war on Canada. Sheila is appointed Secretary of Offense. A public execution of the two comedians is scheduled to take place during a USO show, and the entire conflict is built on the idea that destroying the thing the children love will somehow restore the children to the parent. Cartman, meanwhile, becomes the film's clearest image of parental control taken to its logical end. Because he will not stop cursing, the mothers have a device called a V-chip implanted in his brain by a doctor named Voss Knocker, a chip that delivers an electric shock every time he uses profanity. A parent's frustration with a child's language is solved by wiring that child receive pain on command. The film presents this as monstrous and absurd, and it also presents it as the natural conclusion of the way these parents think. If you cannot raise a child, you can at least install hardware to override him. Against all of this, the children organize. Stan, Kyle, and Cartman form a resistance movement, gather the other children of South Park, and set out to stop their own mothers from executing Terrence and Phillip and igniting the apocalypse. The image the film builds toward is the one the intro promised. The children place their own bodies between the comedians and the firing line, forming a human shield against an execution ordered by their parents. It is the purest version of the show's oldest argument. The adults have become so consumed by the war against their children's culture that the children have to physically protect the world from them. The turn comes when the mothers, with the exception of Sheila, finally see what they have done and abandon the cause to find their own kids, the maternal instinct breaking through the ideology at the last possible moment. Kyle is left to reason with his mother directly, and Sheila is the last to come down from the warpath. By the closing song, she has reversed herself entirely. Patting the two comedians on the shoulder and calling them sweet, the crusade dissolved as quickly as it formed. The detail that ties the film back to the whole pattern is a song the children sing in the middle of it. Cartman, tormented by the V-chip and by Sheila's war, leads the other boys in a song mocking Kyle's mother directly. A song built entirely around the idea that Kyle's mom is the source of the misery. It is the children's counterattack in the propaganda war, and it is aimed not at a country or a network, but at a specific parent. The show had escalated the conflict from a boycott to a global war, and at the center of the global war, it placed the same thing that had been at the center of the first season episode, which was a child and the parent who could not tell the difference between protecting him and controlling him. Terrence and Phillip themselves are the recurring stake in this war, and the show has never let them go. They are the children's most beloved entertainment. Two crude men telling the simplest jokes in the world, and across the run of the series, they are perpetually under threat from the adult world. They are banned, protested, arrested, blamed, and occasionally killed, and they always come back because they represent the thing the children have that the parents cannot take away, no matter how many buildings they throw themselves against. The war over Terrence and Phillip is the war over whether children are allowed to like the things they like, and the show has always sided with the children. The parents, in this first and most foundational conflict, are not depicted as wrong because their concerns are baseless. They are depicted as wrong because they have chosen the loudest possible substitute for actually being present, and because their love keeps arriving in the shape of an army. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing describing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Terrence and Philip Wars showed an entire town of parents going to war with their children's culture while the children quietly went to war with them. Next, the focus turns to a single mother whose love did more lasting damage than any of it, and to the boy that love spent years building into a monster. Section 2. Cartman and the mother who could not say no. Eric Cartman is the closest thing South Park has to a true villain, and for most of the show's run, the audience has been invited to treat his cruelty as something that simply exists, a fixed property of the character, the way a cartoon cat is fixed in its desire to eat a cartoon mouse. He is racist, manipulative, violent, and capable of atrocities that the show has spent decades escalating. The conventional understanding of him is that he was born this way, but the show has been quietly making a different argument since its earliest season, and the argument is uncomfortable. Cartman was not born a monster. He was raised into one in a single house by a single parent through a single sustained failure repeated thousands of times. The parent is his mother, Leon, and the failure is that she has never once been able to tell her son no. The dynamic is visible from the beginning. Leon Cartman is gentle, soft-spoken, endlessly accommodating, and completely incapable of denying her son anything he wants. She cooks him whatever he demands. She lets him stay home whenever he pleases. She refers to him with a steady stream of pet names and treats his tantrums as charming rather than alarming. In the language of parenting, she is permissive past the point of abdication. She has handed her child the entire authority of the household and kept none for herself. The result is a boy who has never encountered a boundary inside his own home and therefore does not believe boundaries apply to him anywhere. Every monstrous scheme Cartman has ever run, every manipulation and act of revenge grows out of the same root, which is a child who learned in his earliest years that the world has no power to refuse him because the one adult responsible for teaching him otherwise never tried. The show made the connection explicit in a way it rarely does in a season 10 episode called St, which aired on the 3rd of May in 2006 and which the creators have described as one of the most serious things the program had attempted about parenting. The premise is that Leon has finally lost control of her son completely and she begins seeking outside help. She turns first to the television expert, the reality show nannies who promise to fix any child. They fail catastrophically. Cartman dismantles each of them in turn, weaponizing their own techniques against them, and one of them, a parody of the famous Super Nanny, ends the episode confined to a mental institution reduced to eating her own weight. The joke is brutal, and the point underneath it is precise. The standard tools of discipline are useless against Cartman because the problem is not Cartman's behavior. The problem is the structure of authority in the home, and none of the nannies can fix that because they are trying to manage the child rather than restore the parent. The episode then brings in Cesar Millan, the real dog trainer known for his television program, and it treats him with surprising sincerity. Millan succeeds where everyone else failed, and he succeeds by ignoring Cartman almost entirely and working on Leanne instead. His method is the method he uses on Dog. He teaches Leanne that she, not her son, must be what he calls the pack leader. He shows her how to project calm authority, how to refuse attention when the child is acting out, and how to use a sharp sound and a light touch to the neck to interrupt bad behavior, the sound that gives the episode its title. None of it hurts Cartman physically. What it does is reverse. For the first time in his life, the flow of authority in the house. For the first time, the adult is in charge. Cartman cannot manipulate his mother because his mother has stopped responding to manipulation. He is so disoriented by this that he runs away from home, spends a miserable stretch living rough on the street, finds that none of the other children will take him in, and finally returns to a house where the rules have changed and he no longer holds the power. What happens next is the part of the episode that elevates it from comedy into something close to tragedy. The training works. Cut off from his ability to control the adults around him, Cartman descends into a genuine crisis, even plotting in his own mind to kill his mother because her death is the only path he can see back to control. He confronts the evil inside himself directly, and on the far side of that confrontation, he comes out reformed. He becomes briefly a good child, considerate, calm, pleasant to be around. The show demonstrates in a single episode that the most irredeemable character it has ever created is in fact redeemable, and that the thing standing between him and decency was never his nature. It was the absence of a single firm hand. For a few minutes of screen time, the experiment succeeds completely, and the audience is shown the boy Cartman could have been if anyone had ever parented him. And then Leanne undoes all of it, and the way she undoes it is the cruelest and most honest thing the episode does. With Cartman finally under control, Leanne realizes something about her own life. Her son was the only thing she had. The chaos of raising an uncontrollable child had been filling a void, giving her someone who needed her totally, and a well-behaved son does not need her in the same way. She turns to Cesar Millan with an unmistakable romantic interest, hoping the man who fixed her home might also fill the loneliness in it. He rejects her plainly, reminds her her that she was only ever a client and leave. And so Liani, alone again and unable to bear it, deliberately reverses everything she has learned. She goes back to spoiling Cartman. She undoes the training on purpose, because a monstrous son who depends on her completely is preferable to a good son who might one day not need her at all. By the end of the episode, Cartman is exactly who he was before, and the audience understands that he will stay that way because the one person who could fix him has decided she would rather keep him broken. His evil is not a fact of nature. It is a choice his mother makes and keeps making out of her own fear of being left with no one. The pattern radiates outward into the rest of the character. Consider his most famous early catchphrase, the demand that everyone respect his authority, which the show introduced in a season 2 episode called Chicken Lover that aired in May of 1998. In that episode, Cartman is deputized as a junior police officer and immediately becomes a tyrant, riding around town on his big wheel and assaulting anyone who fails to acknowledge his power. The line is funny because a small child is playing at being an authority figure. It is revealing because of why he plays at it so naturally. Cartman is obsessed with authority, with commanding it and demanding it, precisely because no legitimate authority has ever been exercised over him. He grew up in a house with no one in charge, so he appointed himself, and the appointment never ended. The boy who screams that the world must respect his authority is a boy who was never given an adult worth respecting. He filled the empty chair at the head of his own household, and he has been trying to sit in that chair everywhere he goes ever since. Even the show's darkest material about Cartman's origin folds back into the failure of his mother, the long-running mystery of his parentage, which the show eventually resolved by revealing that his biological father was a Denver Broncos player his mother had encountered years earlier, depends on Leanne's participation in a town-wide lie about who Cartman really was. For more than a decade of the show's internal time, Cartman was allowed to believe a fabricated story about his own origin, and his mother was among those who let the fabrication stand. The lie was protective in intent and corrosive in effect. One more instance of an adult choosing the comfortable falsehood over the difficult truth where the child was concerned. Leon's instinct again and again is to smooth the surface and avoid the conflict, to give her son whatever keeps the peace in the moment, regardless of what it costs him in the long run. The accumulated cost is the character the audience knows. What the show is arguing across all of this is that the worst child in South Park is also the most thoroughly ruined by parenting, and that the ruin came not from cruelty, but from its opposite. Liani never hit Cartman. She never neglected him in the obvious sense of leaving him hungry or cold. She gave him everything, attended to his every want, and protected him from every consequence. And in doing so, she produced a person incapable of recognizing any interest his own. The show holds the two ideas together without flinching. Cartman is responsible for the terrible things he does, and Cartman is the product of a mother who loved him in the laziest and most damaging way available, who could not say no, and who, when given one chance to fix everything, chose her own loneliness over her son's soul. The monster and the mother are the same story told from two ends. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Leon Cartman could not say the word no, and an entire town has spent decades paying for it. Next, we go to a father who never learned the word at all, a man who has spent the run of the show being a louder, drunker, and far more destructive child than any of the children he is supposed to be raising. Section 3. Randy Marsh, the biggest child in town when Randy Marsh first appeared in 1997 in a first season episode called Volcano. He was a minor figure and an ordinary one, a geologist and a father who existed mostly to be Stan's dad and to occasionally embarrass him. Nothing about those early appearances suggested what he would become. Over the seasons that followed, Randy grew, slowly, and then all at once, into the most reliably destructive force in the entire town, and into something the show had not originally planned for, which was its own center of gravity. By the later years of the series, he was arguably the main character, more present and more story-driving than the four boys the show had been built around. And the reason he could carry that weight is the single trait that defined him across every era of the program. Randy Marsh is the biggest child in South Park. He is louder than the children, more impulsive than the children, more easily obsessed and more easily wounded than any of them. And the people who pay for it every single time are the family he is supposed to be raising. The clearest early portrait of this arrived in a 9th season episode called The Losing Edge, broadcast on the 6th of April in 2005. On its surface, the episode belongs to the boy who have been drafted into Little League Baseball, a sport they despise, and who spend the entire episode trying to lose on purpose so they can get their summer back. The joke of the main story is that every other team in the league hates baseball just as much and is also trying to lose, so the games become contests of who can play worse. Underneath that, in the stands, Randy is running a completely different story, and it is the story everyone remembers. Randy has become the drunk father at the youth sporting event, the one who gets loaded at every game and picks a fight with the dad from the opposing team. He does not experience these brawls as embarrassing episodes of public intoxication. He experiences them as a sport in their own right, a circuit he is climbing, and he begins to train for them in the manner of a boxing film, preparing in a montage for ever tougher opponents in the bleacher. The detail that makes the episode an exact inversion of how a family is supposed to work is the way Randy and Stan trade places. Stan's out in the field, eyes squeezed shut with embarrassment as his father is dragged away by the police again, and the show makes clear that this is not the first time and will not be the last. The child is mortified and resigned, carrying the weariness of a parent who has cleaned up the same mess too many times. The father is thrilled, chasing glory, fully alive in a way he only ever seems to be when he is in the middle of one of his phases. When Randy finally encounters an opponent who frightens him, a larger and more aggressive father who has dressed himself in a Batman cowl and calls himself Bat Dad, Randy does the most telling thing of all. He skips his own son's championship game in order to avoid the fight. The single event that was supposed to be about the boy becomes, in Randy's hands, an event about Randy. And when Randy is scared, he simply does not show up for his child. The boys are eventually disqualified anyway, freed from baseball, and the thing that finally gets them there is one last drunken brawl from Stan's father. The same year produced the episode that gave the dynamic its name and its sharpest edge. Bloody Mary aired on the 7th of December in 2005, the final episode of the 9th season and the 139th overall. It opens with Randy picking the boys up from karate class while drunk, driving them home with a beer between his legs, and getting pulled over after the police spot him trying to relieve himself into a bottle behind the wheel with children in the car. His license is revoked. He is sentenced to community service that includes standing in front of Stan's own elementary school class and explaining what a pathetic example he has set, a humiliation the show stages specifically so that Stan has to watch his father degrade himself in front of his classmate. And then Randy is ordered into Alcoholics Anonymous, where he absorbs the idea that his drinking is a disease he is powerless to control, and he runs with that idea straight off a cliff. Convinced that he is now suffering from a fatal and incurable condition, Randy begins to drink more than he ever has, shaves his head, confines himself to a wheelchair, and decides that the only thing that can save him is a literal miracle. Throughout all of this, the only person in the household behaving like an adult is the 10-year-old. Stan, who knows perfectly well that his father is a hypochondriac with a long history of latching onto whatever idea is placed in front of him, spends the episode trying to talk sense into a grown man. He points out correctly that his father does not have a terminal illness and simply needs to drink less. Randy refuses to hear it. He drags his reluctant son out to a statue of the Virgin Mary that has reportedly begun to bleed, makes Stan drive the car and push the wheelchair, and stakes his reverie on being splashed by the supposed miracle. The episode resolves only when Stan manages to point out that Randy had in fact stopped drinking entirely under his own power during the whole ordeal, proving he was never powerless at all. A child has to walk his father back from a delusion the father chose because it was more comfortable than responsibility. If those two episodes establish the pattern, a later one reveals just how far the show was willing to push the absurdity of Randy's hidden inner life. In a season 18 episode called The Sissy, broadcast on the 8th of October in 2014 and the 250th episode overall, the show revealed that Randy Marsh leads a secret double life as the pop star Lordi. Not an impersonator, the actual artist recording the songs, hiding the money he earns inside the walls of his own house. The cruelty of the reveal is aimed directly at his family. His daughter Shelly is a devoted Lorde fan with the Stars poster on her bedroom wall, and in the middle of the episode she screams at her father that he does not understand her and never will, never once suspecting that the artist she worships and the father she is rejecting are the same man. Randy nags her about spending too much time on her phone in one breath and is secretly the voice she retreats into in the next. When he finally confesses the truth to a disbelieving Stan, walking him through the process of building one of his songs from a single auto-tuned vocal line about feeling good on a Wednesday, Stan faints from the sheer impossibility of it. A father who cannot connect with his own children in the same room has poured all of that hidden creative energy into a costume and a stage name, and he would rather protect the costume than be present as their dad. The Lorde reveal is funny because it is insane, and it is sad for exactly the same reason. The man has more emotional access to a fabricated pop persona than to the two kids living in his house. These 3 episodes are only the most concentrated examples of a behavior that runs through the entire series. In a 13th season episode called Pinewood Derby, Randy's investment in his son's small wooden car race escalates into him stealing a superconducting magnet from a particle physics laboratory and secretly rigging Stan's car to cheat, a scheme that then spirals outward into an intergalactic incident involving the rest rest of the universe and the fate of the planet's reputation among alien civilizations. The competition was supposed to belong to the children. Randy made it his, and he was willing to compromise Earth's standing in the cosmos to win a child's craft contest. The specific obsession changes from year to year. In one stretch, his fixation became televised cooking, an infatuation with the Food Network so total that it pushed his wife to the margins of her own marriage. In another, set off by his anger at the safety rules in football, he sarcastically invented an absurd new version of the sport and was taken so seriously that he ended up coaching the Denver Broncos. In a much later special, he reinvented himself as an online adult content creator, a phase that mortified his children all over again. The most sustained version of this arrived in the show's later season, when Randy uprooted the entire family and moved them out to the countryside to start a marijuana operation he named Tegrity Farm, and then refused to let it be anything other than the absolute center of every member of family's life. Tegrity is Randy's longest phase, and it is also the one that most clearly exposes the self-pity hiding underneath the man-child act. He insists the farm is a family business and uses that framing as a weapon, guilting Stan into wearing the branded shirts and performing the role of the proud farm son, treating any reluctance as a personal betrayal of the family. He accuses his children of not caring about the family while he himself flies overseas to chase deals and skips the things that matter to them, doing genuinely monstrous things abroad to protect his product line, and then returning home to lecture his son about loyalty. When he is criticized, even with complete justification, he does not reflect. He wallows, recasts himself as the wronged party, and demands sympathy from the very people he has hurt. The farm gives the lie its biggest stage because it lets Randy be reckless, selfish, and grandiose, and to call all of it devotion to his family. The deeper joke of the entire Tegrity era is that the word Tegrity is Randy's own mangling of integrity, the one quality he most conspicuously lacks, plastered across a brand he uses to extract labor and loyalty from his children. He has built a monument to a virtue he does not possess, and conscripted his family into maintaining it. The pattern that began with Little League brawls reaches its fullest form here. A father who has made his entire household revolve around his appetites and called the arrangement love. Randy's childishness is at its purest when it takes the form of fear. In a 9th season episode called 2 Days Before the Day After Tomorrow, broadcast in October of 2005, the neighboring town of Beaverton is destroyed when a runaway boat smashes through the world's largest beaver dam and floods it. Randy, positioned by South Park as its leading scientific authority, responds in the most childish way available to him. Rather than help the trapped survivors, he leads the town into a full hysterical panic, declaring a state of emergency, insisting that global warming has become a kind of physical monster that will freeze the planet to tens of millions of degrees below zero, and herding everyone into the community center to barricade themselves against the weather. He stands at the front of the room drawing diagrams of the coming catastrophe and grandstanding in front of a terrified crowd. While the adults cower indoors under Randy's leadership, it is the children who eventually leave the safety of the town to go and rescue the people of Beaverton. The man the town trusts to think clearly is the most frightened person in the building, and the frightened person is somebody's father. What makes Randy unusual, even among the show's bad parents, is that he does not appear to improve with age. The trajectory runs the other way. The mild geologist of the early seasons becomes, year by year, more volatile, more self-absorbed, and more emotionally dependent on his own family for the validation he refuses to offer them in return. His wife Sharon spends much of the show worn down, cycling between patience and despair as her husband chases one new identity after another, and the children learn to read his moods the way children of genuinely unstable households learn to read a room, watching for which phase he is in and bracing for whatever it is about to cost them. The home is organized around the appetites of the dad, and the needs of the kids come second. Every birthday, every game, and every holiday sits one bad Randy idea away from becoming a story about Randy, and the family has long since internalized that the safest posture is to absorb the damage quietly and wait for the current obsession to burn itself out. Even the show's own structure reflects the inversion. The episodes that are nominally about Stan keep getting hijacked by Stan's father, the way a household with one overgrown child keeps getting hijacked by his latest crisis. The boy's Little League season becomes the dad's boxing career. The boy's Pinewood Derby becomes the dad's brush with the cosmos. The boy's quiet evening becomes the dad's confession that he is secretly a pop star. South Park did not set out to make Randy its protagonist. He became one anyway, by doing exactly what he does to his family, which is to take up all the available space and leave the actual children to manage around him. What ties every one of these stories together is the quiet figure standing at the edge of them, which is almost always Stan. The son is the one who notices, the one who is embarrassed, the one who tries to intervene, and the one who is ignored. Across decades of the show, Randy has been arrested hospitalized, addicted, deluded, disguised, and obsessed, and through all of it, he has remained the dependent in the relationship while his children have done the worrying. The show has never treated this as an accident. It has built Randy deliberately as the inversion of fatherhood, parent who is in every meaningful sense younger than his own kid, the man whose every new fixation requires his family to grow up faster in order to compensate for how thoroughly he refuses to. He is funny because he is unrestrained. He is tragic because the lack of restraint is exactly what a father is supposed to provide, and his children have had to learn to provide it for themselves. The biggest child in South Park lives in the Marsh house, and the two actual children there have spent the entire series raising him. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Randy Marsh fails his family by being a child who refuses to grow up. The next failure runs in the opposite direction. Next, we go to a mother who is all adult authority and no restraint at all. A woman who loves her son so loudly and fights for him so hard that the fight keeps landing on the boy himself. Section 4. Sheila Broflovsky goes to war. If Randy Marsh is the parent who never became an adult, Sheila Broflovsky is the parent who became nothing but an adult, a mother whose love expresses itself almost exclusively as warfare. She is the most reliable crusader in the entire town, the first one on her feet whenever something offends her, and across the run of the show, she has launched campaign after campaign in the name of protecting children, especially her own. The pattern is consistent, and it is grimly funny because the wars Sheila starts in defense of her son almost always end with that son standing in the wreckage, more humiliated and more isolated than he was before she began. Her instinct is to fight the world on Kyle's behalf. The casualty of that fight is usually Kyle himself. She introduced herself in exactly this mode. Sheila first appeared in the first season episode Death, broadcast on the 17th of September in 1997, and she arrived fully formed as the architect of the town's protest against Terrence and Philip. Within a single afternoon of discovering the cartoon, she had telephoned every parent in South Park, organized a national boycott, and led the adults of the town across the country to throw themselves against a network building. The crusade was framed from the start as maternal concern, a mother trying to shield her child from corrupting filth, and the episode took pains to show that while she was away fighting that war, the children she was protecting had been left entirely alone and unsupervised. The template she set in her very first appearance is the template she would follow for the next 3 decades. See something offensive, escalate immediately to the largest possible scale, mistake the volume of the campaign for the substance of parenting. The clearest demonstration of how this rebounds on her own family came only weeks later, in the first season Christmas episode Mr. Hanky, the Christmas Pooh, which aired on the 17th of December in 1997 and drew the highest ratings the show had yet seen. Kyle has been cast as Joseph in the South Park Elementary Nativity play, and Sheila is incensed, demanding to know why her Jewish son has been placed in a Christian pageant at a public school and insisting that the religious content be stripped out entirely. Her complaint does not stay contained. It detonates. Once the principle has been established that the play should not offend Broflovskys, every other group in town demands the same consideration for itself, and the school responds by removing anything that could possibly offend anyone at all. Out go the references to Jesus, then Santa Claus, then the wreaths, the trees, the stars, the lights, the candy canes, and eventually even the mistletoe, until the holiday celebration has been scrubbed down to a meaningless abstract song and dance piece in the style of a minimalist composer, a performance that satisfies no one and pleases nothing. The parents, confronted with the empty husk their collective sensitivities have produced, turn on one another and a brawl breaks out, each faction blaming the others for ruining Christmas. And in the dead center of all of it stands Kyle, made miserable by his own mother. The crusade Sheila launched to protect her son's Jewish identity has the precise effect of singling him out, marking him as the reason the entire town's Christmas has been destroyed, and leaving him to feel like the loneliest Jewish kid in Colorado. He is so isolated by the experience that he takes refuge in a friendship with a small talking piece of holiday excrement named Mr. Hanky, a comfort no one else can see, and his classmates and the school counselor respond by having him committed to a mental institution. The episode also handed the show one of its first recurring weapons against Sheila. The song Cartman performs about Kyle's mother, a chant built entirely around insulting her, which the children embrace as their answer to her. The mother goes to war to defend her son's dignity. The son loses his dignity, his standing among his peers, and briefly his freedom, all as a direct result of the war. Sheila never connects the two things. She rarely ever does. The full and final expression of this pattern is the one already described in The War Over Terrence and Philip, the 1999 feature film in which Sheila escalated a complaint about her son's language into an actual global conflict. The organization she founded there, Mothers Against Canada, is the purest distillation of who she is. A mother so committed to the abstract idea of protecting infuriating children that she becomes willing to wage war, install a pain device into child's brain, and order public execution, all under the banner of maternal love. When she is appointed the country's Secretary of Offense, the joke writes itself because offense is precisely the fuel she runs on. The film follows her logic to its endpoint and shows that the endpoint is the apocalypse, narrowly averted only when the other mothers break ranks to go and find their children, leaving Sheila as the last holdout, the one whose certainty burns longest. Her ferocity is not limited to crusades against the wider culture. It extends, in its most sympathetic form, into a fierce and consuming protectiveness over her family, and especially over Ike, the toddler the Broflovskis adopted from Canada. In a second season episode built around Ike's brizz, the ritual circumcision that is a part of the family's faith, that protective instinct gets handed down to Kyle, who badly misunderstands what the ceremony involves and becomes convinced his baby brother is about to be mutilated, launching a desperate and completely misguided campaign to rescue him. The episode plays the panic for comedy, but it also quietly shows where Kyle learned to meet fear with a rescue mission and a wild overreaction. He is his mother's son. The household runs on intensity, on the unspoken conviction that love means hurling yourself at a threat at full speed, and Kyle absorbed that lesson very early, even as he spent his childhood embarrassed by the woman who had taught it to him. The most moving version of Sheila's love, and the one that complicates the satire, came in a 7th season episode called It's Christmas in Canada, broadcast on the 17th of December in 2003. During the family's Hanukkah celebration, a Canadian couple named Harry and Elise Gintz appear at the Broflovskis' door, reveal themselves to be Ike's biological parents, and demand that the boy, whom they call by his birth name, be returned to them. The family takes the case to court and loses, and Ike is taken away to Canada. What the episode lingers on afterward is the sight of Sheila and Gerald slowly falling apart in the absence of their son, deteriorating week by week, undone by a loss they have no campaign capable of fixing. For once, there is no protest to organize, no organization to found, no authority to browbeat. There is only grief, and it is Kyle, watching his parents come undone, who finally rallies the other boys to travel to Canada and bring his brother home. The episode is proof that underneath all the warfare, Sheila's love is real and deep. The tragedy is that she only seems to know how to express it as a fight, and when a fight is not available, she has very little left. Her listed occupation in the show is fittingly activism, and her defining reflex is escalation, the impulse to take every grievance straight to the top, to demand to speak to whoever is in charge, to treat a school play or a cable cartoon as a matter requiring national mobilization. It is worth noting that the Broflovski household produces this kind of public warfare from both of its parents, only in opposite directions. Sheila wages her wars in the open, earnestly as the town's loudest and most sincere crusader. Her husband Gerald, a lawyer, eventually reveals a capacity for a darker and far more cowardly version of the same drive, conducting his own war against the world anonymously and cruelly from behind a keyboard, a development the show would later build into an entire season. The two of them form a matched set, two parents who both turn their grievances with the culture into campaign, one loudly and one in secret, and the child caught in the middle is the same in both cases. Kyle spends his childhood as the son of the town's most relentless crusader, defended in public and embarrassed in private, the beneficiary and the casualty of a love that does not seem to have any setting other than maximum. The contrast between Sheila and her husband eventually became the engine of an entire season. In the show's 20th year, Gerald Broflovski was revealed to be a prolific anonymous internet troll operating under the handle SkankHunt42, a man who spent his nights tormenting strangers online purely for his own entertainment, harassing people to the edge of ruin while presenting himself at the breakfast table as a mild and decent father. The arc built toward a near global catastrophe, as a foreign service threatened to expose the real identity of every troll on the internet, and Gerald spent the season in escalating terror that his family and his town would discover what he had been doing in the dark. His wife campaigns against cruelty in the open, under her own name, certain of her own righteousness. Her husband practices cruelty in secret, behind a false name, certain of nothing except that he must not be caught. They are two halves of the same impulse, the need to act out a grievance with the wider world, split into its sincere and its cowardly forms, sharing the same house and raising the same son. Kyle grows up between these two, and the show has quietly tracked what that does to him. He becomes the most morally serious of the four boys, the one most likely to take a stand on principle, the one who delivers the show's sincere arguments on the rare occasions when it has one to make. Some of that is clearly inherited from his mother, the conviction that wrongs must be confronted rather than ignored. But Kyle has also watched over and over what happens when that conviction is cut loose from judgment, and he has been the one left cleaning up afterward. He has been humiliated at school because of his mother's protests. He has been the only sane person in the room while she escalated a small small offense into a national emergency. The result is a boy who shares his mother's moral intensity and has spent his entire childhood learning the hard way how to aim it more carefully than she ever has. Sheila's defining trait across every appearance is the reflex to escalate. She does not write a letter when she can organize a boycott. She does not raise a quiet concern when she can demand to speak to whoever is in charge. Confronted with anything she dislikes, her first move is to take it to the highest authority available, and if that authority is not high enough, she will go looking for a higher one. The show leans on this so consistently that it functions as her whole characterization. She is the parent for whom no response is ever proportionate, because a proportionate response would mean sitting with a problem rather than declaring war on it. And the problems she chooses to make war on are almost always problems involving her children, which means her children are forever being defended in a way that draws maximum attention to them and offers them the minimum possible comfort. The episodes built around Ike are the ones that keep the audience from writing Sheila off entirely, because they show that the warlike instinct grows out of something real. When her adopted son is taken from her by his Canadian birth parents through a court she cannot beat, she has no campaign to fall back on, and the show lets the audience watch her simply come apart under a grief she has no weapon to fight. The same intensity that makes her insufferable on the attack is, underneath, a genuine and bottomless attachment to her family. She is neither a cynic nor an indifferent parent. The depth of her love was never the thing in question. What failed her was the single channel she had for expressing it, which is conflict, and conflict has a way of consuming the very people it was meant to protect. It is telling that the show has kept Sheila in this exact role for its entire existence, never softening the pattern and never letting her learn from it. Other characters evolve over the decades. Sheila is a constant. Whenever the program needs someone to take offense first and loudest, to gather a crowd, to turn a private worry into a public spectacle, she is the one it reaches for, because the role fits her perfectly and always has. She is the embodiment of the parent who has confused fighting for a child with raising one, and the show returns to her again and again precisely because that confusion never resolves. The wars end, the offenses are forgotten. Kyle grows a little older, and the next time something crosses Sheila Broflovsky, she rises to her feet exactly as she did in 1997, ready to take it all the way to the top, with her son already wincing beside her. What Sheila represents in the show's long argument about parents is the failure that looks most like devotion, which makes it the hardest one to see clearly. She is not neglectful in the way Leon Cartman is neglectful, and she is not absent in the way the town's fathers are absent. She is intensely, exhaustingly present, and that presence is the problem, because it arrives as a battering ram. She cannot reliably distinguish between protecting her son and conscripting the entire world into a war about him, and because she cannot make that distinction, the son keeps becoming a flag she plants on every hill she charges. The show treats her with a strange affection underneath the satire, because her heart truly is in the right place, in a way almost none of the other parents' hearts are. Sheila genuinely loves Kyle and would do anything for him. The thing the show keeps returning to is that the anything she does for him is almost always a war, and that wars, no matter how lovingly they are declared, tend to flatten the very thing they were fought to protect. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Sheila Broflovsky loves her son too loudly, and the volume keeps wounding him. Next, the focus turns to a house where the volume points the other way. A quiet, tidy home where a small boy is grounded for everything, blamed for nothing he did, and slowly taught that the safest thing he can be is invisible. Section 5, the Stotch household. Leopold Stotch, known to everyone as Butters, is the kindest soul in South Park. He is unfailingly polite, relentlessly cheerful, quick to forgive people who treat him terribly, and almost incapable of cruelty even when cruelty is done to him. He is also, by a wide margin, the most abused child the show has ever depicted, and the two facts are connected. Butters lives with his parents, Stephen and Linda Stotch, in a tidy, ordinary house, and behind that ordinary front door, the show has staged some of the darkest material it has ever produced about what parents can do to a child. The household runs on punishment, on appearances, and on a love so conditional and so volatile that it has, on at least one occasion, tipped over into attempted murder. The miracle of Butters, and the quiet horror the show keeps returning to, is that he came out of that house as sweet as he is. His goodness survives in spite of his parents, not because of them. The defining feature of life in the Stotch home is the grounding. Stephen Stotch grounds his son constantly, reflexively, and almost always for things that are entirely beyond the boy's control. A disaster happens nearby, and Butters is grounded. Someone else misbehaves and Butters is grounded. The punishment arrives with the regularity of a tick delivered in a stern, joyless tone, and Butters accepts it every time with a small stammering apology, as though he has long since concluded that whatever went wrong must somehow be his fault. The grounding is played as a running joke across the entire run of the show. The boy trudging up to his room yet again for a crime he did not commit, but the joke has a floor underneath it that the show is careful never to fully cover. This is a child being trained to believe that he is perpetually in trouble, perpetually one mistake away from his parents' anger, and that the safest response to any situation is to apologize first and understand later. The psychological residue of this is visible whenever the show pauses on Butters alone. Left himself, he talks to himself the way his parents talk to him, scolding himself, calling himself names, working himself into the same anxious apology he performs for Steven and Linda. He has mentioned that he sometimes wakes to the sound of his own screaming. The punitive voice of the household has been installed inside him so thoroughly that it runs even when his parents are not in the room. The show presents these moments lightly as quirks of a funny little boy, and they are some of the saddest things in the series because they are the unmistakable signature of a child raised under constant correction. Butters does not need his parents present to be punished. He has internalized them. The full horror of the Stotch household arrived in a 5th season's episode broadcast on the 12th of December in 2001, an installment built entirely around Butters and titled as his very own episode. The premise begins as something close to a gentle family sitcom. The Stotches' wedding anniversary is approaching. They plan to celebrate at Butters' favorite restaurant, and Linda asks her son to secretly follow his father in order to find out what gift Steven is planning, so that her own gift will not fall short. Butters takes to the assignment with delight, casting himself as a cheerful little detective. What he discovers, with no understanding of what he is seeing, is that his father has been spending his evenings at an adult theater and a bathhouse for gay men. Butters reports all of this to his mother in the same chipper, oblivious tone he uses for everything, having no idea that he has just detonated his parents' marriage. What Linda does with that information is the part of the episode that turns the comedy to ice. She does not confront her husband first. She decides in a single unhinged moment that she will end her own life and that she will take Butters with her, reasoning that her son should not have to grow up without a mother or be raised by the man who betrayed her. She tells Butters they are going for a car ride. She drives to a river, puts the car in neutral with the boy still strapped inside, tells him to stay put and not unbuckle his seatbelt, and walks away to leave him to drown. And Butters, trusting his mother completely, sits in the sinking car chatting happily about his day at school, slow to register that the water rising around him is a problem at all. The current carries the car downstream before it fully submerges, and the boy survives by accident, washed far from home, while his mother believes she has killed him. The back half of the episode follows Butters making his way home alone through the seediest parts of the city, still determined to reunite his parents in time for their anniversary dinner because he has decided the whole situation is a misunderstanding he can fix. Meanwhile, his parents, having concluded that Butters is dead, set about covering it up. They lie to the press, inventing a story about a stranger who took him, and the show places them in a lineup alongside other public figures who had famously deceived the public about crimes against their own family. When Butters finally returns home alive, the resolution is not justice. His parents are never arrested. Linda's attempt to murder her son and the elaborate lie that followed are simply absorbed into the household, treated as an embarrassing episode best not discussed, and the family heads off to the restaurant as though nothing happened. The single lesson Butters takes from nearly being drowned by his mother is delivered by him to his parents when he scolds them gently for trying to teach him that lying is acceptable. The child is the one with the moral clarity. The parents get away with everything. This was not an isolated incident in the Stotch home, only the most extreme one. In a 6th-season episode, the parents physically beat Butters as punishment for swearing at them when the words had in fact come from Cartman and Butters had done nothing at all. The pattern is consistent across the series. Butters is punished for what other people do, disciplined for outcomes he did not cause, and held to a standard of behavior that no child could meet in a home where the response to any disruption is to find Butters and make him answer for it. The beatings and the groundings are the same instinct expressed at different volume, the conviction that the boy is a problem to be managed rather than a child to be raised. The household's obsession with appearances over the child's actual well-being reached another peak in a 7th season era storyline in which Steven, terrified that his son might be gay after seeing a misleading photograph, shipped Butters off to a Christian camp designed to convert gay children into straight ones. The camp is a place of quiet despair, full of confused and miserable boys who have been told that something is fundamentally wrong with them, and one of the campers is driven to the edge of a literal cliff, prepared to jump before Butters talks him down. Steven's reasoning throughout is not concern for his son's happiness. It is fear of what his son being gay would say about Steven, fear of the embarrassment, fear of the appearance. He would rather send the boy away to be broken and rebuilt than sit with the possibility of who his son might actually be. The camp nearly kills a child, and the lesson the episode lands on is that there is nothing wrong wrong with any of these boys and a great deal wrong with the parents who sent them there. It would be a simpler story if Linda and Steven felt nothing for their son, but the show refuses to let them off that easily because indifference would be less damaging than what they actually offer. When Butters fakes his own death in another episode, dressing as a girl to infiltrate a slumber party, Linda becomes genuinely hysterical with grief, and when he goes missing in other stories, his parents are frantic. The love is real. That is precisely what makes the household so corrosive. Butters is not unloved. He is loved by two people whose love arrives wrapped in control, conditioned on his behavior, and liable at any moment to curdle into rage or panic or worse. He has grown up unable to predict which version of his parents will appear, the affectionate one or the punishing one, and so he has defaulted to the only posture that seems to keep him safe, which is to be agreeable, apologetic, and good at all times no matter what is done to him. The cost of all that suppression surfaces exactly once, and the show treats it as significant. After the other boys cast him aside, Butters retreats to his basement and reinvents himself as a supervillain, donning a costume and a new name, and declaring war on the world that has wronged him. The villainy is hapless and harmless, his schemes never amount to anything, but the impulse behind it is the clearest window the show ever gives into what is happening underneath the boy's relentless cheer. There is rage in there, the accumulated weight of every unjust grounding, and every punishment for someone else's crime, and the only way Butters has found to let any of it out is to pretend to be a cartoon villain in his parents' basement. The supervillain is what is left over when a child is never allowed to be angry at the people who keep hurting him. What the Stotch household represents in the show's long argument about parents is the particular damage done by parents who treat a child as a reflection of themselves. Everything Steven and Linda do to Butters is in service of how the family looks, how the marriage holds together, how the boy reflects on them. His feelings, his confusion, his fear, and on one occasion his life are all secondary to the maintenance of the surface. And the most chilling part of the whole portrait is the boy it produced. Butters did not become bitter. He did not become cruel. He became the sweetest, most forgiving child in town, because somewhere very early he learned that sweetness and forgiveness were the only things that ever made the punishment stop. The show lets his kindness read as what it is, which is the survival strategy of a child who has been taught that he is always somehow the one who needs to say sorry. The pattern of Butters being lost while his parents register it late recurs more than once across the series. In one episode, Cartman convinces him that the world has ended and talks him into hiding in a fallout shelter for days, simply so that Cartman can steal his place on a trip to a Mexican restaurant. Butters vanishes for the better part of a week and emerges filthy and disoriented, and although his parents do search for him, the story quietly underlines how easily a boy like Butters slips out of the center of his own family's attention. He is the kind of child the world misplaces, trusting and uncomplaining and slow to suspect that anyone means him harm. His home trained him to be exactly that kind of child, and the wider town takes full advantage of it. That trained compliance is what makes Butters the most exploitable child in South Park, and the show has never let the connection go unremarked. Cartman in particular uses him relentlessly, enlisting him in schemes, talking him into humiliations, betraying him outright, and counting every time on the certainty that Butters will forgive him and come back. Butters keeps coming back because forgiveness and accommodation are the only tools his parents ever handed him. A child raised to absorb blame and to apologize for things he did not do becomes, almost inevitably, a child that crueler people learn to operate like a machine. The damage done inside the Stotch house does not stay inside the Stotch house. It follows Butters out the front door and into every relationship he has. Part of what makes the household so disorienting is that the rules inside it are never stable. Steven's groundings do not track to any consistent standard of behavior, arriving for real offenses and imagined ones with equal frequency, and Linda's moods swing between doting warmth and sudden frightening intensity. The boy cannot learn what will keep him safe because safety in that house is not a function of anything he actually does, so he overcorrects in the only direction available to him, becoming as agreeable and as transparent and as eager to please as a child can possibly be, hoping that if he is good enough and open enough and sorry enough, the punishment might not come this time. It comes anyway, on a schedule he can never predict, and he apologizes for it anyway, and then the whole cycle quietly resets for the next round. The deepest cruelty the show identifies in the Stotch household is not any single grounding, or even the attempt on his life. It is the way the household has taught Butters to misread his own treatment as love and his own relentless goodness as the price of admission to that love. He does not resent his parents, he defends them. He believes somewhere underneath that the constant correction is simply what parents are supposed to do, and that his only job is to deserve it a little less each day. The show keeps Butters cheerful precisely so the audience will feel the gap between how the boy experiences his childhood and what his childhood plainly is. He thinks he is a lucky lucky kid with a nice family and a nice house. The audience can see that he is the most consistently mistreated child in town, and that the sweetness everyone finds so endearing is the sound of a boy who worked out very early that the alternative was never going to be allowed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Stotches punish a child who did nothing wrong in a home obsessed with how it looks. Next, the focus turns to a family with nothing to keep up appearances with at all. A household so poor and so neglectful that its oldest son has had to become the only parent his little sister has ever really had. Section 6. The McCormicks and the cost of being poor Kenny McCormick dies in nearly every early episode of South Park, and the joke has been running so long that it is easy to forget what kind of family it happens to. Kenny is the poorest of the 4 boys, the child of Stuart and Carol McCormick, and his household sits at the very bottom of the town's social order. The McCormicks are not bad parents in the way Leon Cartman is a bad parent through suffocating indulgence, or the way the Stotches are bad parents through control and punishment. The McCormicks fail their children through poverty and the things that travel with it: the drinking, the fighting, the instability, the simple inability to provide. And because the parents cannot or will not hold the household together, the work of holding it together has fallen quietly and almost entirely onto a child. Poorest kid in South Park is also, when the show finally looks closely, the most parental figure in his own home. The conditions in the McCormick house are established early and reinforced constantly. The parents drink heavily and argue loudly. The home is run down and chaotic, and there is never enough of anything. Kenny's orange parka, the hood pulled so tight that his speech comes out muffled and unintelligible, is the uniform of a kid wearing whatever was available. The other children mock the McCormicks for being poor. The adults treat the family as a cautionary example, and the show returns again and again to the image of the McCormick home as the place where South Park keeps its underclass. The poverty is not a one-episode subject the show raises and then drops. It is a permanent fact of Kenny's life, the water he swims in, present in the background of every story he appears in, even when no one comments on it. The neglect that comes with that poverty is most visible in the thing the show built into a running gag. Kenny dies, over and over, in horrifying ways, and his parents barely register it. There is no sustained grief in the McCormick house, no sense that the family is organized around protecting its children from harm, because the family does not have the stability to organize around anything. The deaths are absorbed the way everything else is absorbed, and life continues. The show plays this for comedy, but the comedy rests on a grim foundation, which is the idea of a child whose repeated destruction barely disturbs the household he lives in. A poor kid, the gag quietly suggests, is a kid the world treats as replaceable, and the first place that treatment begins is at home. The show eventually tied even the mechanics of Kenny's curse back to his parents' poverty. In a later arc, it established that Stuart and Carol, in their younger years, had attended the meetings of a strange cult, drawn there by the promise of free beer, the kind of offer a family with nothing finds hard to refuse. Carol was pregnant with Kenny at the time, and the cult performed a ritual none of them understood, with the unborn child present at the center of it. That ritual is the canonical reason Kenny cannot stay dead. The detail is played as dark comedy, but the logic underneath it is pointed. The parents made a choice driven entirely by their poverty, going wherever the free alcohol was, and the child is the one who has paid for that choice ever since, dying and returning and dying again, carrying a curse he did not ask for because his parents went somewhere for the free beer. If the household were simply a place of neglect, Kenny might have grown up as careless as the family that raised him. He did not, and the reason is the person the show reveals to be the actual center of his emotional life, which is his younger sister, Karen. Kenny has an older brother, Kevin, who is largely absent and ineffective, and a little sister who is small and vulnerable and entirely dependent on someone to look out for her. In a home where the parents cannot do that work, Kenny has taken it on himself. He loves Karen with a fierce, protective tenderness that the show doles out carefully in small moments so that it lands hard when it finally comes into focus. The careless poor kid who dies for laughs in the opening credits is, in his own house, the one steady source of care his sister has. The vehicle Kenny uses for that care is his superhero identity, Mysterian. When Kenny puts on the hood and the cape, he becomes a different and more articulate version of himself, a child who has taken the chaos of his life and tried to bend it toward a purpose. The purpose, more than anything else, is Karen. In the 15th season episode built around the family's poverty, Karen refers to Mysterian as her guardian angel, not knowing that the masked figure watching over her is her own brother. Kenny has built himself a secret identity whose primary mission is to protect his little sister from a world and a household that will not protect her on its own. He is a child playing a hero because being a hero is the only way he has found to do the job his parents have abandoned. That episode is where the show makes the dynamic explicit. The state removes the McCormick children from the home after their parents are arrested, and the kids are placed into the foster foster care system. The system, in the show's telling, is its own kind of failure, a foster home run by people collecting government checks for warehousing children, a place with no more genuine care in it than the home the kids were taken from. The children are passed around, processed, and treated as line items. And through all of it, Kenny keeps slipping out at night in his Mysterian costume to check on Karen, to reassure her that she is not alone, that someone is watching, that she will be alright. The biological parents have been removed from the picture, the foster parents are a bureaucratic fiction, and the only person actually parenting Karen is her grade school brother in a homemade cape. What the episode lays bare is a role reversal as complete as the one in the Marsh house, only born of poverty rather than immaturity. Kenny is not a child with parents who happen to be poor. He is functionally a parent himself, the one who notices when Karen is frightened, the one who comforts her, the one who shows up. The adults in his life, his mother and father, and then the foster system, form a chain of institutions that were supposed to care for these children and did not, and Kenny has stepped into the gap because someone had to and no one else would. The show lets the audience feel the weight of that. A boy who cannot reliably keep himself alive has appointed himself the guardian of someone even smaller because the alternative was to let her face the same indifference alone. The bullying that surrounds the family adds another layer to what Kenny absorbed. Being the poor kid is a social position as much as an economic one, and the show is clear-eyed about the cruelty that attaches to it. Kenny is mocked for what his family does not have, ranked at the bottom, reminded constantly of his place. He carries that the way he carries everything, without much complaint, hiding the hardship behind the muffled hood and the easy shrug. Of the four boys, he is the one who asks for the least and reveals the least, and the poverty is a large part of why. A child who has learned that his needs will not be met learns fairly quickly to stop announcing them. It would be unfair to paint Stuart and Carol as monsters, and the show generally does not. Failure is real, and its consequences for their children are severe, but it is a failure of capacity more than a failure of will. They are defeated people, ground down by poverty and addiction, lacking the resources, the stability, and often the sobriety to be the parents their kids need. The show does not let that excuse the neglect, because the neglect lands on the children regardless of its cause, but it does complicate the picture. The McCormicks are not cruel. They are simply not able, and in a household, inability and cruelty can produce the same bruises on a child. The difference matters to how we judge the parent. It does not much change what it is like to be their son. The contrast with the other failing households in town is what makes the McCormicks distinct. Leanne Cartman has the means to parent and lacks the will. The Stotches have the will in their warped way and aim it like a weapon. The McCormicks have neither the means nor, by the time the show meets them, much of the will, and what fills the vacuum is a 10-year-old in a parka who has decided that his sister, at least, will not go uncared for. Every one of these produces a child forced to grow up wrong, but the McCormick version is the one rooted most plainly in money, in the simple, grinding fact of not having enough, and in the way that a shortage of money has a way of becoming a shortage of everything else a child needs. Kenny's resilience is the quality the audience is meant to admire, and also the quality that should worry them most. He endures, he dies and comes back and goes to school and looks after Karen and asks for nothing, and he does it with a steadiness that no child should have to develop. That steadiness is not a gift, it is a callus, the thing a person grows over a wound that keeps getting reopened. The show built its longest running joke on the idea that Kenny can survive anything, and somewhere underneath the joke, it has been telling a quieter story about what it costs a child to become that durable, and about who he became durable for. The poorest kid in South Park learned to take a beating from the world and keep standing, and then he turned around and put himself between that same world and his little sister. What the McCormicks represent in the show's long argument about parents is the failure that the other families could at least theoretically have avoided, because it is not really a failure of character at all. It is what happens when a household has nothing, when the adults are too depleted to parent, and the institutions meant to catch the children are hollow, and when the only functioning source of care left in a child's life is another child. Kenny carries Karen because the chain of adults above him broke, one link after another, until the job landed on the smallest shoulders available. He is the guardian angel of a little girl who has no idea her angel is a poor kid in a cape doing his parents' job for them because somebody had to, and he was the only one who showed up. It matters that Kenny is not the oldest child in the house. He has an older brother, Kevin, who could in principle have taken on the work of looking after the younger ones, and who does not. Kevin drifts through the family as another casualty of it, present but checked out, offering Karen nothing in particular. So the responsibility skips sideways and lands on Kenny, the middle child, who was never first in line for it and shouldered it anyway. There is something quietly telling in that arrangement. The job of caring for Karen did not fall to Kenny because he was the obvious choice or the eldest. It fell to him because he was the one willing to do it, and willingness in the McCormick house turned out to count for more than than age or birth order or anything else. The town's treatment of the family compounds the damage at home. South Park as a whole regards the McCormicks as a standing punchline, the poor family whose poverty is itself the joke, and the children grow up steeped in that judgment. Kenny is reminded of his place constantly in the casual cruelty of classmates and the condescension of adults who treat his family as a problem rather than as people. A child learns a great deal about his own worth from the way the world around him talks about his home, and what Kenny absorbs is that his home is something to be ashamed of and kept hidden. The hood pulled tight over his face is, among other things, placed to keep a face the town has already decided how to feel about. Karen is the one part of his life Kenny refuses to let the world treat as cheap. The show grants their relationship a tenderness it rarely extends to anyone else. The older brother turning up at his little sister's side whenever she is frightened or alone, telling her that she will be alright, that someone is watch out for her, that she is loved. He does it in costume, as her secret guardian, because the costume lets him be the protector. He cannot always manage to be as plain Kenny McCormick, the poor kid with the broke parents and the brother who checked out. For Karen, the guardian angel is real and steady and always there. For the audience, the guardian angel is a small boy quietly doing the one job his parents were meant to do and never could. The cruelty the show identifies in the McCormick household is the way poverty silently transfers the duties of the parents down onto the children and then expects the children to carry those duties without complaint. Kenny does not get to be a kid in any uncomplicated way. He is a worker, a protector, a guardian, a child who has internalized that the world will not soften for him and that the smaller people around him are his to shield. He shoulders all of it with the same uncomplaining shrug he brings to his own repeated deaths, and the show lets that shrug stand as the saddest thing about him. A boy this resilient was made resilient by a childhood that offered him no other option, and the toughness everyone admires in him is really just the shape a kid is forced into when there is no adult standing above him to absorb the weight of the world. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The McCormicks fail one household quietly through poverty and exhaustion. Next, the focus turns to what happens when all of the town's parents fail at once. In a mob, the panics and crusades and witch hunts that South Park's adults launch as a herd, and the children who keep getting trampled underneath them. Section 7. The parent mob. The parents of South Park are bad enough one household at a time. Gathered into a crowd, they become something worse, and the show has spent its entire run documenting the difference. Individually, Liani is permissive, Randy is childish, Sheila is combative, the Stotches are punitive, and the McCormicks are absent. Collectively, the adults of the town form a single panicking organism, a mob that can be whipped into a frenzy over almost anything in the space of an afternoon, and that reliably tramples its own children in the process. The recurring engine of countless South Park episodes is the spectacle of the town's grown-ups losing their minds in unison, and the recurring victims are the kids who happen to be standing nearby when the stampede begins. The mechanics of the mob are consistent enough to be a formula. Some piece of alarming information enters the town, often through the news, and the adults seize on it with total conviction. They organize, they escalate, they take some collective action wildly out of proportion to the actual threat, and then, within an episode, they forget the entire thing ever happened and move on to the next panic. The adults of South Park do not hold beliefs so much as they catch them, the way a crowd catches a mood, and they shed them just as fast. What never changes is the intensity. Whatever the town believes this week, it believes it completely, and it is prepared to burn down a great deal to act on it. The prototype for all of this is the founding conflict already described, the war over Terrence and Philip. When Sheila organized the boycott in the first season, and the mothers built their army in the feature film, the show was establishing the template it would use for decades. A threat to the children is identified, the parents mobilize as a herd, and the response swells into something monstrous, all while the children themselves are left unattended or actively endangered by the very crusade meant to protect them. Every parent mob that follows is a variation on that original theme, the adults marching in formation toward a danger that is mostly in their own head. One of the clearest examples arrived in a 6th season episode about child abduction, broadcast in 2002. The town is gripped by news reports of children being kidnapped, and the parents respond by descending into total paranoia. They decide that the solution is to wall off South Park entirely, to build a physical barrier around the town to keep all strangers out, and they contract the work to a local restaurant owner who sets about constructing it. The wall is the mob's logic made concrete. The adults have concluded that the world beyond the town is nothing but predators, and that the answer is to seal the children inside a fortress, regardless of what that does to the children or to the town. The paranoia does not stop at the wall. As the panic deepens, the parents reason their way to an even more disturbing conclusion. If strangers are the threat, and a stranger is simply anyone you do not know well, then the safest thing is to assume that everyone is a potential abductor. The circle of suspicion widens until it includes essentially all adults, and the parents, unable to trust anyone, eventually decide that the children would be safer away from people altogether. The protection curdles into something close to expulsion. The kids, smothered and endangered by the very adults claiming to safeguard them, end up driven out of the arrangement entirely, which is the episode's blunt point. The parents' fear was never really about keeping the children safe. It was about managing the parents' own terror, and the children were the material that terror was worked out upon. That is the thread running through every parent mob the show stages. The panic is performed in the name of the children, but it is fundamentally about the adults, about their fear, their need to feel they are doing something, their susceptibility to a frightening story. The kids are the pretext and the collateral at the same time. They are invoked constantly as the reason for the crusade and harmed constantly as a consequence of it, and the adults rarely notice the contradiction, because noticing would require the kind of sustained attention the mob is specifically designed to avoid. The children, for their part, are not above exploiting the machinery once they understand how it works. In a 4th season episode from 2000, the boys make a discovery that turns the town's panic instinct into a weapon. They learn that an adult can be removed from their life almost instantly by accusing that adult of molestation, because the grown-up world responds to such an accusation with immediate, unthinking, total alarm. Armed with this knowledge, the children of South Park set about getting rid of their parents wholesale, leveling the accusation at every adult in town in order to free themselves from chores and rules and supervision, and the adult population is duly carted off to jail. The kids have used the parents' own hair-trigger panic against them, and it works flawlessly. What follows is the show's grimmest joke about what children actually are. With every adult removed, South Park becomes a society run entirely by kids, and that society collapses with astonishing speed into a violent tribal dystopia. The town splits into warring factions, the children regress into something out of a survival nightmare, and a pair of visiting outsiders stumble into what looks like a miniature post-apocalyptic war zone populated by grade schoolers. The episode indicts both sides at once. The parents created the condition, the panic, and the credulity that the children's exploited, and the children, freed from those parents, proved utterly incapable of governing themselves. Neither generation comes out looking competent. The adults are a mob that can be tricked by a single magic word, and the children are savages the moment the mob is removed. The panic engine runs in episode after episode, with different fuel each time. The town has been thrown into collective hysteria over violence in video games and the weapons children play with, over the supposed epidemic of sexual harassment, over global warming dramatized as a literal monster, over satanic threats and stranger danger, and any number of media-driven scares. In each case, the structure is identical. A frightening idea arrives, the adults adopt it as one, the response balloons into absurdity, and the children are left to either suffer the consequences or quietly clean up the mess. The specific panic is interchangeable. The shape of the mob is permanent. What makes the mob so dangerous is the complete absence of any adult willing to stand apart from it. South Park has almost no grown-up who reliably keeps their head while the others lose theirs. When the herd begins to move, it moves as one, and the few moments of adult clarity that do occur are swept aside instantly by the momentum of the crowd. The town has no brakes. There is no parent in the position to say that the wall is insane, that the accusation machine is monstrous, that the monster chasing them is imaginary, because the social pressure of the panic is total and instantaneous. The mob does not tolerate dissent, and so it never encounters any. The cost of all this falls, predictably and repeatedly, on the children. In the abduction panic, they are imprisoned and then expelled. In the molestation episode, they are first the weapon and then the victims of their own success. In the endless parade of media scares, they are the supposed beneficiaries of crusades that consistently make their lives worse. The parents of South Park, taken as a single body, are a machine for converting fear into harm, and the harm flows downhill to the people with the least power to refuse it. The children are not protected by the mob, they are processed by it. The deeper thing the parent mob reveals is the true nature of South Park's adults, which only becomes fully visible when they are gathered together. One frightened, credulous, easily led parent can pass for an ordinary person having a bad day. A whole town of them, moving in lockstep towards some imaginary danger, reveals the underlying truth the show has been arguing all along. The adults of South Park are not measured, rational stewards of their community who occasionally overreact. They are a herd, governed by fear and rumor, capable of monstrous collective behavior, and more childish in a crowd than any actual child the show has ever drawn. The mob is the parents with the mask off, and in nearly every one of these episodes, the people who see the situation most clearly are the children. While the adult herd builds its wall, or jails its neighbors, or barricades itself against the weather, it is usually one of the boys who recognizes the absurdity, who tries to point it out, who ends up resolving the crisis the adults manufacture. The kids are the ones who notice that the Emperor has no clothes, because they are the only ones standing outside the crowd. The show has built its entire civic universe around this reversal, a town where the supposed grown-ups are a hysterical mob, and the actual minors are the closest thing to functioning adults in the room. That reversal is not incidental. It is the foundation of how South Park sees the relationship between parents and children, and it is the thing every individual household has been quietly demonstrating all along. The mob simply shows it at scale. When the whole adult population of the town panics as one, and the children are the only ones keeping their footing, the show is making its central argument about parents as loudly as it ever makes it. The grown-ups cannot be trusted to act like grown-ups, and the work of being reasonable has fallen once again to the kid. The litigious version of the mob is its own recurring spectacle. In a third season episode, the town becomes convinced that sexual harassment is lurking everywhere, and the adults respond by suing one another with abandon. Every grievance converted instantly into a lawsuit, until the entire community is locked in a frenzy of litigation that enriches no one and slowly bankrupts the town itself. A well-meaning school mascot invented to teach children about the issue becomes the unlikely face of the hysteria, and the parents ride the panic straight into financial ruin. The lesson the episode lands on is that the adults took a real concern, inflated it into a mania, and then chased the mania off a cliff, dragging their kids along behind them. It is the same machine as the abduction wall, running on slightly different fuel. The mob's instinct for misplaced priorities got one of its sharpest treatments in an 8th season episode, in which the boys acquire real martial arts weapons. A child ends up with a throwing star lodged in his eye, a genuine medical emergency unfolding in front of everyone, and yet when the parents finally gather to be outraged, the injured boy is barely what they noted. What mobilizes their full collective fury is the sight of one of the children running around with no clothes on. The town pours all of its alarm into a moment of cartoon nudity while a kid bleeds a few feet away, and the episode simply lets the absurdity stand on its own. The parent mob does not aim its panic at the actual danger to children. It aims at whatever offends the adult's sense of decency in the moment, and the two are almost never the same thing. Sometimes the mood the herd catches is not fear at all but self-righteousness, and the show is just as merciless about that. When the town's parents collectively adopt a fashionable new virtue and begin congratulating themselves on their own enlightenment, the smugness itself thickens into a physical menace hanging over the community, a cloud of self-satisfaction dense enough to threaten everyone underneath it. The adults grow so pleased with their own moral superiority that they cannot see the harm their preening is doing, and once again it is the children who get shuffled around and endangered, while the grown-ups bask in how good they feel. Whether the herd is frightened or proud, the outcome is identical. The adults move as one, the feeling drowns out their judgment, and the kids are left to clean up what is left. Underneath every one of these panics sits the same quietly damning fact about the adults of South Park, which is that they cannot hold a belief for any longer than a story required. The wall that consumed the town is never mentioned again. The lawsuits that bankrupted everyone simply evaporate. The monster that had them barricaded indoors is forgotten by the following week. The parents commit to each new convictions with absolute world-ending seriousness, and then drop it without the slightest memory that they ever held it at all. This is precisely why the panics never teach the town anything. A community that forgets its last hysteria cannot possibly learn from it, and so it stays permanently available to the next one. An entire population of adults with no institutional memory and no immunity to whatever frightening story arrives next. What the Parade of Panic satirizes, of course, is the real version of the same behavior, the long procession of moral alarms that move through actual towns about the things children watch and play and stumble across. South Park stages these panics as deliberate exaggeration, but the exaggeration is modest, and the recognizable core of it is the adults' eagerness to be terrified on their children's behalf, without ever quite turning to look at the children themselves. Against all of it stands the show's one stable pole: the kids, who carry forward what they learn while the adults forget, who spot the absurdity the grown-ups are too swept up to notice, and who keep ending up as the only members of the town with a working memory and a level head. The mob forgets, the children remember. That single difference is the whole argument the show is making. Gathered into a crowd and set in motion, the parents of South Park reveal themselves completely. The cover that ordinary individual life provides falls away, and what is left is a herd, frightened and credulous and forgetful and capable of real damage, periodically trampling the very children it claims to be stampeding to protect. The parent mob is not a distortion of who these adults are. It is the truest picture of them the show ever offered. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The parent mob shows the town's adults at their most childish, moving as a frightened herd, while the children keep their head. Next, the focus turns inward to a single family and a single marriage, and to the devastating episode where the show let a boy watch his parents come apart and refuse to put them back together by morning. Section 8. You're getting old in the Marsh marriage. The most devastating thing South Park has ever done with parents is not a crusade or a scheme or a mob. It is a marriage quietly coming apart, watched by a child who cannot stop it. In a 15th season episode broadcast on the 8th of June in 2011, the show set aside its usual machinery and told a small, intimate story about Stan Marsh turning 10 years old and about what happens to his family when he does. The episode is titled around the idea of getting older, and it remains one of the few times the program ever allowed a wound to stay open past the closing credits. There was no reset the following week. The damage carried forward. For a stretch of broadcasts, viewers genuinely believed the show might be ending because it had finally let one of its families break in a way that looked permanent. The premise is deceptively simple. Stan has a birthday and becomes 10, and almost immediately his perception of the world begins to curdle. Music starts to sound like noise to him. Films look like garbage. The food he used to love tastes wrong. Everything around him takes on the appearance of waste, literally, the show rendering his disillusionment as a world that has visibly turned to filth before his eye. A doctor diagnoses him with cynicism, and the episode treats the diagnosis with complete seriousness, refusing to play it as a joke. Stan has aged into the recognition that the things that once delighted him are hollow, and the recognition is poisoning everything he looks at, including his own home. While Stan's inner world is collapsing, his parents' marriage is collapsing alongside it, and the episode draws the two collapses in parallel. Randy and Sharon, worn down by years of the dynamic described earlier, by Randy's endless obsessions and Sharon's endless patience, finally reach the end of what they can sustain. They separate. Randy moves out of the house. The family that the audience has watched for well over a decade simply comes apart, and the show stages the breakup not as a plot beat, but as a genuine loss set to a melancholy song, the members of the household drifting into separate rooms and separate lives while the music plays over them. The line that closes the episode is the one that gave it its weight. Sharon, exhausted, tells Randy that the same thing keeps happening to them, week after week, the same arguments and the same frustrations producing the same outcomes and never once changing. Randy has no answer for her. The show lets the silence sit, and the audience understood immediately that Sharon was not only speaking to her husband, she was speaking through the screen, naming the structural condition of the show itself, the way the same plots and the same panics and the same characters reset endlessly with nothing ever truly changing. Sharon had been trapped in that loop for 14 years, and she was tired of it, and the show let her say so out loud. The continuity carried directly into the companion episode broadcast a few months later, which refused to undo what the first had done. Stan was still cynical. The world still looked like waste to him. He had been given something to take the edge off, to let him function through the disillusionment, and the somethings was alcohol. The show placed a flask in the hands of a 10-year-old boy and had him drink secretly at the kitchen table in the morning before school, because that was the only way he had found to make the world tolerable. The image is one of the bleakest the series has ever produced, a child self-medicating with liquor to survive a home that had come apart around him. On the surface, the second episode walked things back. Stan's parents got back together. His friends began speaking to him again. The format reasserted itself enough to let the show continue, but the resolution was deliberately incomplete. Stan was still drinking at the end. The marriage had been reassembled, but the boy at the center of it had been quietly broken in a way the reconciliation did not fix, and the show let that broken thing remain visible underneath the tidy surface for anyone paying close enough attention to see it. What makes the storyline land so hard is that it is told almost entirely from the child's point of view. Stan does not get to vote on whether his parents stay together. He does not get an explanation he can accept. He simply watches the way children of separating parents always watch, as the two people who are supposed to be the fixed points of his world will reveal that they are not fixed at all. The helplessness is the point. The most stable family among the four boys, the one with two married parents in a single house, turns out to be as fragile as any of the others, and the fragility is exposed to a 10-year-old who can do nothing but absorb it. The Marsh marriage had been straining for the entire run of the show, and this episode was simply the moment the strain became undeniable. Across the seasons, Randy's serial obsessions had repeatedly pushed Sharon to the margins of her own life. His fixation on televised cooking, his various reinventions, his refusal to be the adult in the household. Sharon spent years as the lone functioning grown-up in the Marsh home, doing the emotional labor for a husband who behaved like a third child, and the toll of that arrangement is exactly what surfaces in the breakup. Her exhaustion in that final scene is not sudden. It is the accumulated weight of carrying a marriage by herself for far too long. Years later, the show returned to the Marsh family to show where the whole trajectory ends, in a pair of of specials set decades in the future. The boys are middle-aged, they have grown apart and lost touch. The town has decayed into a bleak version of itself, and the long arc of the Marsh family is drawn to its conclusion, with Randy revealed to have been the source of a catastrophe that reshaped the world, his recklessness finally metastasizing into something that hurt far more people than just his family. The future the show imagined for these characters is one of estrangement and regret, the closeness of childhood revealed in hindsight as the highest point any of them would reach, with everything after it a slow falling away. The bleakness of that future is the show telling the audience, as plainly as it knows how, that these families do not heal. The instability the children grew up inside does not resolve into stability when they become adult. It propagates. The boy who drank at the kitchen table to survive his parents' separation grows into a man who has built his adult life around the same disillusionment, and the family whose collapse he witnessed at 10 never fully recovers from it. The show follows the thread to its end and finds, at the end, exactly the damage the early episode planted. The reason all of this cuts deeper than the show's usual material is that it was personal for the men who made it. The creators have been open about the fact that the episode came out of their own exhaustion. 14 years into producing the program on a brutal weekly schedule, while building other projects, growing older, getting married, becoming fathers themselves. Stan, turning 10 and finding the world drained of color, was a portrait of two men in their offices looking at the show they had created in their 20s and wondering whether they had outgrown it. The parents aging and the show's aging and the creators aging were all folded into a single story, which is part of why it carries a sincerity the rest of the series usually keeps at arm's length. The role reversal that runs through every household appears here too, in its quietest and saddest form. Stan is the one who sees the marriage clearly. He is the one who registers that something is fundamentally wrong, the one who cannot pretend the dysfunction away the way the adults around him do, and he is also the one who pays the highest price for it, because a child has no power to fix a parent's marriage and no ability to protect himself from its collapse. He can only watch and absorb and find a flaw. The clearest-eyed person in the Marsh house is the 10-year-old, and being the clearest-eyed person in that house is precisely what poisons him. What the Marsh marriage represents, in the show's long argument about parents, is the failure that is no one's villainy in particular. Randy is not cruel and Sharon is not negligent. They are simply two people who could not hold their family together, whose own limitations and exhaustion and arrested development wore down the thing their son depended on, and the show insists on showing the audience what that does to a child from the inside. Stan's cynicism is the inheritance of a home that could not stay whole. His drinking is the symptom of a boy left to manage feelings far too large for him with no functioning adult to help carry them. The episode endures because it refused the comfort the format usually provides. South Park could have given Stan his happy ending and reset the family by the next week, the way it resets everything else. Instead, it let the marriage break, let the boy turn to drink, let the wounds stay open, and then followed the characters decades into the future to confirm that the wound never fully closed. It is the show's most honest statement about what it means to be the child of parents who cannot manage their own lives. The damage is real, it is lasting, and the person least equipped to bear it is the one who ends up carrying it. The marriage had been showing its cracks for years before the breakup, often in episodes that were ostensibly about something else entirely. In one, Randy's consuming obsession with televised cooking pushes Sharon so far to the edge of his attention that the neglect itself becomes the actual subject of the story, a wife trying and failing to be noticed by a husband lost in the roar of the Food Network. The pattern recurs across the run of the series. Whatever Randy's fixation of the season happens to be, Sharon is the person it displaces, and she spends years quietly absorbing the role of the overlooked partner of a man who treats each new enthusiasm as more urgent than the family in front of him. The later Tegrity era placed the marriage under the same pressure in a fresh form. Randy's marijuana enterprise swallowed the family whole, and Sharon, along with the children, was conscripted into business she had never agreed to, and a way of life she plainly did not want. Her objections were steamrolled by Randy's insistence that the farm was a family project, and the marriage strained yet again under the weight of a husband who could not tell the difference between his own ambition and his family's wishes. Across decades and across obsessions, the constant has been Sharon's slow erosion, the steady wearing down of a woman married to a man who refused to grow up. Stan is not the only child in that house, and the show occasionally lets the audience see how the dysfunction lands on his older sister, Shelly, as well. Where Stan turns the instability inward and it curdles into cynicism, Shelly turns it outward and it comes out as rage, a teenager perpetually furious at parents who do not understand her, and at a father who happened, unbeknownst to her, to be the very pop star she idolizes. The two Marsh children embody two responses to the same broken home, the boy who goes quiet and bitter and the girl who goes loud and angry. Neither of those responses is available to a child who is being parented well. They are both reactions to the same absence sitting at the center of the household. What the cynicism storyline understood, and what made it so painful to watch, is that the show framed Stan's condition as a form of clarity, the plain result of his having started to see his life and his town and his family as they actually were. The world did look like garbage to him, because a great deal of it was. The marriage was failing in front of him, because it had been failing for years. The boy was not imagining things. He had simply woken up, and being awake in that house was the thing that drove him to the flask. The episode's refusal to wave the condition away with a tidy cure was its way of respecting the truth of what the boy had seen. The personal dimension is what gives the whole arc its unusual gravity. The men who created South Park built it as young provocateurs, and by the time of the breakup episode, they had spent 14 years on a punishing weekly schedule, while their own lives moved on around them, into marriages and children and middle age. Stan turning 10 and finding the magic drained out of everything was, by their own account, a portrait of themselves. Two creators staring at the thing they had made in their youth and quietly wondering whether they had outgrown it. The aging of the parents on screen, the aging of the show, and the aging of the men behind it had all folded into one story, and the sincerity of that overlap is why the episode does not feel like anything else in the series. The Marsh marriage, in the end, is the show's quietest and most honest indictment of parents, precisely because there is no crusade to point at and no villain to blame. There is only a family that could not hold itself together, a boy who watched it fail, and a future the show was willing to follow all the way to its sad conclusion. It is the parent failure that looks the most like ordinary life, the slow, undramatic erosion of a marriage, and the child standing in the middle of it, which is exactly why it lands harder than any of the louder failures around it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Marsh marriage showed the damage a child absorbs when his parents cannot hold their family together. Next, the focus turns to the newest version of the South Park parent, the one with a phone in hand, and to what happened when the town's adults were handed the internet and used it to become crueler, vainer, and more absent than ever. Section 9. The smartphone parent. As the real world moved online, so did the parents of South Park, and the move did not improve them. The internet did not make the town's adults wiser, calmer, or more present. It handed their existing flaws a larger stage and an anonymous mask, and the worst version of the South Park parent turned out to be the one with a phone in his hand. The vanity, the cruelty, the panic, and the absence that the show had spent years documenting in living rooms and school auditoriums simply migrated into feeds and forums and streams where they could operate at greater scale, with less accountability, and at a further remove from the children they affected. The digital age parent is the same failing parent the show always drew, only network. The definitive portrait of this is Gerald Broflovsky, who was revealed in the show's 20th season to be living a hidden second life as an anonymous internet troll. By day, Gerald is a lawyer and a seemingly ordinary father, mild at the dinner table, unremarkable in the school pickup line. By night, he is a figure who spends his hours tormenting strangers online for sport, posting cruelty under a handle that conceals his identity, harassing people he has never met purely for the entertainment of watching them suffer. The gap between the two Geralds is the whole point. The man who presents himself to his family as a decent, reasonable parent is, in private, one of the most gratuitously cruel people in town, and his cruelty is possible precisely because the screen lets him be something his family would not recognize. The season-long arc built that private cruelty into a near catastrophe. A service emerged that threatened to expose the real identity of every anonymous troll on the internet, to strip away the masks and attach every cruel post to the actual person who wrote it, and Gerald spent the season in mounting terror that his family and his town were about to discover who he really was. The threat escalated until it endangered far more than one man's reputation, and Gerald, who had treated the whole thing as a game, found himself trapped inside the consequences of it. The arc understood something true about the digital parent. The anonymity that lets him be cruel is also the thing he is most desperate to protect, because the version of himself he performs for his children cannot survive contact with the version he indulges online. The hypocrisy is the part the show lingers on. Gerald is perfectly capable of lecturing his son about decency, of taking the parental tone, of presenting himself as a man with values. He does all of that while running a secret campaign of harassment that embodies the exact opposite of everything he claims to stand for. His son Kyle, who has inherited a genuine moral seriousness, has no idea that his father is one of the people poisoning the well Kyle keeps trying to clean. The household contains a parent who preaches one thing to his child and practices its opposite in the dark, and the device in his pocket is what makes the double life possible. If Gerald shows the parent who uses the screen to hide his cruelty, another episode shows the parents who use it to rot in plain sight. In a story about the adults' viewing habits, parents of South Park become collectively addicted addicted to a genre of lurid, violent true crime television, the kind of programming built around real-life murder dressed up as entertainment. They consume it compulsively, neglecting everything else until the children become genuinely disturbed by what their parents are watching and by how thoroughly the watching has consumed them. And the children respond with one of the most pointed role reversals the show has ever staged. The kids use the parental controls on the household devices, the very feature designed to let parents restrict what their children can see, and they turn it around. They lock their parents out of the adult content. The children become the censors, the responsible party deciding what the grown-ups are mature enough to handle, and the parents are reduced to sneaking around the restrictions like teenagers trying to beat a curfew, scheming to get back to their forbidden screen. The inversion could not be more complete. The technology built to let parents supervise children is repurposed by the children to supervise the parents, because in that household, the children are the only ones exercising any judgment about what belongs on a screen. The newest version of the digital parent is the one chasing an audience. In a later special, the parents of South Park discover that they can monetize themselves online, turning their own bodies and lives into content for paying strangers, and they throw themselves into it with the same heedless enthusiasm they bring to every trend. The pursuit of online income and online attention becomes another thing that pulls them away from their children, and the children are left mortified, watching the adults who are supposed to be raising them instead performing for an internet audience. The parent who would rather be a brand than a parent is a recurring figure in the show's later years, and the phone is the instrument that makes the choice frictionless. Randy Marsh, unsurprisingly, sits at the center of this tendency too. His whole later arc is the story of a father chasing audiences and enterprises and online identities, from the marijuana brand he plastered across his family to the various reinventions he pursued for attention and money. The secret pop star life described earlier is of a piece with all of it, a man who has more emotional investment in a manufactured public persona than in the children in his house. The smartphone era simply gave Randy more channels through which to be absent, more screens to disappear into, more audiences to perform for instead of parenting. What runs underneath all of these stories is the phone itself as an instrument of parental absence. The South Park parent has always been prone to disappearing into his own dramas, but the device makes the disappearing total and constant. A parent absorbed in a feed is a parent not looking at his child. A parent performing for strangers is a parent not present for the people in the room. The cruelty, the vanity, and the distraction that the show had always attributed to these adults found in the smartphone a perfect delivery system, one that lets a parent be physically present and emotionally elsewhere at every moment of the day. The adult's susceptibility to online manipulation is part of the same picture. The town's parents, already established as a herd that catches beliefs like a mood, became even more susceptible once the moods could be delivered straight to their hands at all hours. The same credulity that built walls and filed lawsuits in earlier seasons now expresses itself in feeds full of outrage, nostalgia, and manufactured panic, and the parents consume all of it as uncritically as they ever consumed a local rumor. The networked version of the mob is faster, larger, and harder to escape, and the parents walk into it with the same eagerness to be frightened and the same inability to remember they were frightened about something else last week. The children, meanwhile, tend to handle the digital world with more competence and more conscience than their parents do. They are more fluent in it, less likely to be fooled by it, and frequently the ones who recognize when the adults have lost themselves in it. The episode in which the kids lock their parents out of the murder programming is the clearest case, but the pattern recurs. The children are the ones who see the harm the adults cannot see, exercise the restraint the adults will not exercise, who end up acting as the responsible parties in a digital landscape their parents have made worse. Once again, the generational roles are reversed, this time across screen. There is a particular cruelty in the way the digital parent can do harm at a distance. The Gerald arc makes this explicit. A man can sit in his own home beside his sleeping family and reach out through a screen to devastate a stranger he will never meet, and then set the phone down and go back to being a father. The harm is real, and the distance makes it feel weightless to the person causing it. The smartphone parent is capable of an absentee cruelty that the earlier generations of South Park parents could not have managed. A way of being monstrous that requires no confrontation, leaves no visible trace at home, and can be switched off the moment a child walks into the room. What the digital era ultimately reveals is that technology did not change the parents of South Park, it amplified them. The troll dad is the combative crusader from earlier seasons with an anonymous mask. The murder television addicts are the panic-prone mob with a streaming subscription. The content-chasing parents are the attention-seeking man-children with a monetization scheme. Every digital parent in the later seasons is a recognizable continuation of a type the show established long before anyone in town owned a smartphone. smartphone. The medium is new. The failure is exactly the same one the show has been documenting since the very beginning, and the children remain where they have always been, on the other side of the screen, watching their parents behave worse than they do and quietly doing the work the adults will not. The kid setting parental controls on his own parents is the perfect emblem of the whole era. He is a child handed a tool meant to manage children, using it to manage the grown-ups, because the grown-ups have proven that they cannot be trusted with the very freedoms they spend so much energy denying him. The smartphone changed the surface of South Park completely and changed the underlying relationship between its parents and its children not at all. The adults are still the ones who need supervising. The kids are still the ones supplying it. The Gerald arc widened as it went into an indictment of more than one man. The season suggested that anonymous cruelty online extended well beyond a single rogue father into something closer to a widespread habit, that any number of ordinary respectable adults were quietly doing some version of what Gerald did once the screen handed them the cover to do it without being seen. The troll was not an aberration in the town so much as a representative case. The most fully drawn example of an impulse the show implied ran all through the adult population, the eagerness to be cruel without consequence set loose at last by a technology that promised the cruelty would never be traced back to the house it came from. The contrast with the children is sharp throughout. The kids of South Park grew up inside the digital world rather than stumbling into it as adults, and they navigate it with a fluency and a wariness their parents conspicuously lack. They understand how the platforms work, how the manipulation operates, how to tell a genuine thing from a sponsored one, in ways the adults around them simply do not. The grown-ups approach the internet the way they approach everything else, as a herd ready to be frightened or flattered or sold to, while the children approach it as natives who have learned to keep their guard up. The generation supposedly too young for any of it turns out to be the generation handling it with the most care. The town's adults proved especially helpless against the blurring of advertising and reality that the digital era brought with it. In one stretch, the show built an entire arc around the growing impossibility of telling real information apart from paid promotion, and the parents of South Park were its perfect marks, unable to distinguish a true story from an advertisement, wearing a story's clothes, swallowing sponsored manipulation as though it were news. The same credulity that had made them a mob in earlier seasons made them ideal consumers in this one, a population of parents who would believe and buy nearly anything delivered to them through a screen, with no defense against it and no memory of having been fooled the same way before. More than any single arc, what the smartphone gave the South Park parent was the perfected form of absence. The earlier generations of the show's parents had to physically leave the house to neglect their children, to drive across the country for a protest, or vanish into the latest obsession. The smartphone removed even that requirement. Now a parent could be sitting at the same table as a child and be entirely elsewhere, attention buried in a feed, performing for strangers, tending an anonymous grudge, present in body and gone in every way that counted. The device made it possible to abandon a child without ever leaving the room, and the show returned to that image again and again, the parent and the child sharing a single frame with only one of them actually in it. What the digital era confirms in the end is that the screen introduced no new failing into the South Park parent at all. What it did was reveal and magnify the failings that were always there. The cruelty had always been in Gerald. The credulity had always been in the mob. The vanity and the absence had always been in Randy. The internet simply handed each of them a more powerful instrument and a wider reach, and stripped away the friction that had once kept their worst impulses partly in check. And through every bit of it, the children stayed the steady one. The digital natives keeping their heads, the kids locking the controls on their own parent, the generation that handled the new world with a maturity the old generation never managed to find even in the old one. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The smartphone gave the town's parents new ways to be cruel, vain, and absent, and left the children doing the supervising once again. Next, in the final breakdown, all of it comes together. Every household and every crusade pointing to the single truth the show has been telling from the very first episode, that in South Park the children were the adults all along. Section 10. The children were the adults all along. One pattern has run underneath every household and every crusade in this breakdown so quietly and so consistently that it is easy to mistake it for the background rather than the point. In South Park, the children are the adults and the adults are the children. The roles have been reversed from the very beginning in every family the show has ever examined, and the reversal is the single deepest thing the program has to say about parents. The grown-ups have been installed in the position of the kids forced into the position of the grown-ups, and the show has spent nearly 3 decades demonstrating it one family at a time. The evidence is overwhelming once it is named. Leon Cartman could not bring herself to be the parent, so her son sees seized the authority she abandoned and made himself a tyrant, a child performing the role of an adult because no actual adult would perform it for him. Randy Marsh chases obsessions, throws tantrums, and disappears into manufactured identity, while his 10-year-old son does the worrying, cleans up the messes, and supplies the restraint a father is supposed to provide. The biggest child in South Park is a grown man, and the steadiest adult in his house is a boy. The other households tell the same story from different angles. Sheila Broflovsky wages war in her son's name, and Kyle is the one left wincing through the humiliations and cleaning up the wreckage, the careful one, because his mother never was. Butters absorbs years of unjust punishment, and a mother who once tried to kill him, and comes out of it the kindest and most forgiving soul in town, the composure of an adult grown inside a child who was never allowed to be one. Kenny, with his parents defeated by poverty and his older brother checked out, becomes the only guardian his little sister Karen has ever had, patrolling the neighborhood in a homemade cape because a real protector was needed and no grown-up volunteered. 5 households, 1 pattern. The child is the adult in everyone. The reversal holds at every scale. When the town's parents gather into a panicking mob, terrified of abductors or barricaded against an imaginary monster, it is a child who keeps a level head and ends the crisis the adults manufactured. When the Marsh marriage collapses, it is Stan who sees it clearly and pays the highest price for the clarity. When the digital age arrives, it is a child reaching for the parental controls to lock his own parents out of the content they cannot handle. The supervision runs backward in every direction the show points the camera. Underneath all of it sits a structural fact about the show. The 4 boys are the only consistent moral consciousnesses in South Park. They learn, they carry the lessons of one episode into the next, they hold a line when a line needs holding, and they deliver the show's sincere arguments on the rare occasions it makes one. The adults do none of this. The adults reset. Whatever the town believed last week is gone without a trace, leaving the grown-ups permanently available to the next panic and permanently incapable of learning from the last. Continuity, memory, and growth, the actual machinery of adulthood, all of it lives in the children. The adults simply loop. That difference is the engine of the whole satire. By placing adult folly in a town where actual children are forced to be the responsible ones, the show throws the childishness of the adults into the sharpest possible relief. A grown man behaving like a child is one thing. A grown man behaving like a child while his 10-year-old son tries to act like the parent is something the audience cannot look away from. The joke and the indictment turn out to be the same joke. The cost of the arrangement falls, as it always does, on the children. Being the adult in a house full of children is a deprivation, not a triumph, and each of these kids lost a childhood to it. Stan's cynicism, Kenny's calluses, Butters' compulsive apologizing, Kyle's wariness, and even Cartman's monstrous hunger for control are all the marks of children who had to fill a chair the adults left empty and who were shaped permanently by the weight of sitting in it. The wisdom and the resilience the audience admires in these boys were purchased at a steep price, and the price was the childhood that functioning parents are supposed to provide. It would be unfair, though, to leave the parents as simple villains, and the show generally refuses to. The adults of South Park are also, in their way, victims of the same condition. They are arrested because they were probably never finished either. Children who were failed and grew into adults who fail in turn. Leon, Randy, Sheila, the Stotches, the McCormicks, the whole panicking herd of them never became the grown-ups they were supposed to be, and they are now raising children destined to grow up too fast to make up the difference. Everyone in South Park is a child. Some of them are simply older. The through line holds across the entire history of the show. From the first season, when a mother led the town to war against a cartoon while her son was left home alone, to the latest episode streaming now, the conflict between South Park's children and their parents has never resolved, and it never will, for a simple reason. The parents never grow up, and the children are never allowed to be young. There is one last turn to it, the one the show grew into as it aged. The men who created South Park as young provocateurs have spent decades becoming the very thing they built it to mock, middle-aged fathers looking back at the boys they invented in their 20s from the far side of the divide. The satire of parents has slowly become a self-portrait. Cartman is the most complicated figure in this whole pattern, at once its clearest product and its hardest case. Raised by a mother who could never tell him no, lied to for years about who his own father was, and left to install himself as the only authority in a home that had none, he became monstrous, precisely because he absorbed the lesson that nothing and no one would ever check him. His tyranny belongs to the same pattern as everything else, as one of its outcomes. A kid handed adult power with no adult to model how to wield it grows into a despot, and Cartman is what that looks like once it is followed all the way down. There is a generational dimension to this that real time has only sharpened. The people who first watched South Park as kids in the late 90s are, many of them, parents now. They grew up, the boys did not. An entire audience has crossed the same divide the show's creators crossed, drifting from the side of the children over to the side side of the adults, while Stan and Kyle and Cartman and Kenny remain exactly where they have always been. To watch the show now as a grown person is to find oneself on the uncomfortable side of its central joke, no longer among the clear-eyed kids, now among the clueless grown-ups the kids keep having to manage. That is the image the whole show finally resolves into, once every household and every crusade and every panic has been laid side by side. A town full of grown bodies and childish minds, governed by fear and appetite and forgetfulness, and a small handful of children moving through the middle of it, carrying the weight the adults will not lift, keeping the memory the adults throw away, supplying the judgment the adults cannot find. The kids never asked for the job. It fell to them because the chair was empty and somebody had to sit in it. So every time South Park goes to war with parents, what it is really showing is two generations that have traded places and cannot trade back. The adults are the children, frightened and forgetful and consumed by their own appetite. The children are the adults, perceptive and burdened and old before their time. The town is one long argument that the people in charge are the ones who should not be, and that the steadiest, most genuinely grown-up figures in South Park have been the entire time the kid. That is the joke the show has been telling since 1997, and it is also the saddest thing about the town. In a place full of parents, the children were the only adults all along. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.